Spacefarer. What the UFO? I'm speaking with Dr. William Parsons today. William, it's great to meet you. Thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you, Caleb. Good to be here.
It's an honor to be speaking with you. I'm just going to read a little bit from your CV for a brief introduction. The top line for folks just meeting William is that he's a highly esteemed and accomplished professor of religion. William Parsons is a professor of religious studies at Rice University. He's written and edited several books going back to the 90s, including The Enigma of the Oceanic Feeling, great title, Teaching Mysticism, Religion and Psychology, Mapping the Terrain, Mourning Religion, as in O-U-R, Freud in Dialogue with Augustine, Psychoanalysis, Mysticism, and the Culture of Modern Spirituality, great one, as well as dozens of essays in multiple journals and books. He's served as chair of the Department of Religious Studies at Rice University, as director of the Humanities Research Center at Rice University, as editor in the Psychology of Religion section with Religious Studies Review, and he is associate editor of the international series in the Psychology of Religion. He's been a fellow at the Martin Marty Center of the University of Chicago and at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Hebrew University. Does that about sum it up?
Yeah, I'm exhausted just listening to that. Actually, I feel old now.
Well, I feel like it's important for people to understand the breadth and depth of your knowledge and your wisdom coming into this. I, again, am honored to speak with you, and I'm a neophyte in these topics, so please forgive me if I ask very simple questions.
That's fine. I just, as a counter to what you said, you should talk to my students because they don't believe any of that stuff. So
I'm curious about how this subject we're going to get into plays into your teaching, if at all. But you proposed a rough roadmap for our conversation that we should lay out for people here. We're going to do nuts and bolts, as in empirical evidence, then experiencers, those that have had contact, and then religion, how the latter two rubrics impact the study of religion. So would you like to start us off in nuts and bolts?
Right. So that tripartite structure is one that we use to conduct a conference at Rice University where I teach under the umbrella of something called Archives of the Impossible. Not everyone has heard of that, but that is a archive that was started by my colleague, Dr. Jeff Kripal. And this happened a number of years ago where Jeff was talking to a guy named Jacques Vallée, who people in the UFO world know, sort of the dean of UFO studies. And he wanted a place to put a lot of his papers. And so they got to talking, and then Jeff went to the administration and they opened up an archive for Vallée's papers. And then subsequently, we got a host of other people wanting to donate their papers, people like Whitley Strieber, who some people know from his book called Communion. And then the John Mack Institute. Now, John Mack was a psychiatrist at Harvard and did a lot of work with what he dubbed the experiencers. And then the floodgates opened. We got literally tens of thousands of documents, and we're now in the process of putting them into digital form. And then that will be available for scholars to peruse. And we've had, I think this is the third annual Archives of the Conference session, and this is the first one specifically dedicated to the UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomenon, for those who don't know the new terminology, or the NHI, right? The non-human intelligence, right? It used to be just aliens, and now we're just not really sure what it is, so we just call it non-human intelligence. And so we use this tripartite structure to talk about this phenomenon. And to expand on this just a little bit, there's an increasing number of scholars who are becoming interested in this topic. At Harvard, for example, there's something called the Galileo Project, which is headed by Avi Loeb, who is an astrophysicist. And you can go on Google that, and you can see the people that are involved, and it's quite a prestigious list. Mostly scientists. He is a scientist himself, so they're looking at the empirical part, or what I call nuts and bolts. And we have what I call a weak relationship with Avi. I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean that all of these institutes sort of correspond with one another, and the people on his board come down and talk with us, and we go up there and talk with him. And then there's another institute called the Sol Foundation, Sol being SOL, the third planet from the sun, Sol, which is headed up by Gary Nolan, who does a lot of work in cancer research, and a guy named Peter Skafish, who's an anthropologist. And they have their board, and they come down and talk with us. So this is sort of three major centers. And whereas Abby does mostly empirical nuts and bolts stuff, and Gary does a lot of science stuff because he is a scientist, they also do a little bit of what we call woo, if I can put it that way. Mm-hmm. The sort of the more consciousness stuff, sort of the out there stuff. And Rice does mostly woo stuff. So we're a little bit different from Galileo Project, a little bit different from Soul. And the reason is because, Jeff is a professor in the Department of Religion, as I am as well. And so although we welcome scientists, we are also very interested in how this impacts religion. So, that's sort of a brief landscape. Now, the three-part structure is we wanted to emphasize a little bit more of, the woo. And so, but you have to start with the nuts and bolts. I mean, it's hard not to start with the nuts and bolts. And the reason is because if people are going to listen to what appears to be an actual phenomenon here, you have to start with some sort of empirical data. And, as we were talking before the show, it was really in 2017 when Leslie Kane, the journalist, who's done really yeoman work here, published with a couple of other people in the New York Times this story about the Tic Tacs. And the Tic Tacs were apparently these anomalous objects that an aircraft carrier off the coast of San Diego was seeing. And they have film and radar. And David Fravor, who was one of the pilots that went up and saw the Tic Tacs, was on 60 Minutes. I think people can Google that and listen to his testimony. And this went on apparently for several days. And from what I understand, it's much more complicated than just a series of radar pictures. It was a whole fleet of them. And there was some underwater activity as well, what they call USO, underwater submerged objects that were going on. Meanwhile, on the East Coast, the Air Force was basically seeing other kinds of phenomenon on a practically daily basis as they were doing their training exercises. And so Ryan Graves would be the guy to Google on this. And he's quite adamant about it. And they have all kinds of photos, some which have not been released. So there's a lot of pictures going on that we only get a little bit of as the government, tries to sort of release it. And then, of course, there's the David Grush component of this. He testified before Congress that we have downcraft, well over a dozen, as well as biologics, as he likes to put them, which are bodies. And of course, this was astounding, but he was under oath. And for those of you out there who want to investigate this further, you might want to go to News Nation and go to their UFO desk. And there is a video with Rubio. This was before he was Secretary of State, and it's about 16 minutes long. And he was being interviewed by one of the correspondents for News Nation. And the first 10 minutes is about the UAP. And basically what he said was there are a lot of dozens of high-level military people coming in and, as he put it, talking about really extraordinary things. And as he said, these are serious people, right? They're not lying, but they're all about these secret government projects on these downed craft. So don't take my word for it. I keep telling people, don't be a passive recipient. Go out actively and look at this stuff, and you follow your nose. You'll come to your own conclusions. But what I can say is there are a whole bunch of scientists who are working on this. There's Wes Waters at Wellesley. There's Kevin Knuth at SUNY Albany. These are astrophysicists. Avi Loeb, of course. Greg Agigian, who's a historian of religion at Penn State, has written a book on this. Eric Davis, he's a physicist at Baylor. And the list goes on. So gradually, scientists are coming to see that there is really something there. And you can also, I got a little list of some quotes that might help people. These are DNIs and CI directors, past and present, people like John Radcliffe, who's talking about this phenomenon. And this is, you can Google it and see it on, I think this was MSNBC, I'm not really sure, but one of the CNN, something like that. He said these objects, quote, engage in actions that are difficult to explain, movements that are hard to replicate, that we don't have the technology for. Avril Haines, she said the objects might come extraterrestrially, which is a pretty big thing to say. John Brennan, he said the objects might constitute a different form of life. Well, I'm going to come back to that, but that is pretty interesting. Chris Mellon, of course, the former Deputy Assistant Director of Defense, he said, frankly, the alien hypothesis fits the facts better than the alternatives. And then there are reputable politicians like Fife Symington, who's governor of Arizona, who poo-pooed the whole Phoenix Lights business, but then later came and said, I saw it. And he said, what is the quote? What I saw in the Arizona skies goes beyond conventional explanations. This is a guy who was an Air Force pilot, and he saw the giant craft that people were talking about. Of course, there's President Obama, who is quoted by saying, there's footage and records of objects in the skies that we don't know exactly what they are. There are a bunch of astronauts, Gordon Cooper, Edgar Mitchell, of course, people like David Fravor and Ryan Graves, Tim Gallaudet, the Rear Admiral in the Navy, who saw what they call the Go Fast video. You can also Google that. I've talked with all these people. They're not lying. Colonel Carl Nell, retired now, but I've had extensive conversations with Carl. He's not lying. He's come right out and said they're here. They've been here for a long period of time. It's go do your homework, is what I say. There's a bunch of pictures out there aside from the Tic Tac, the Go Fast, and what they call the gimbal. There's a picture of the Costa Rica UFO that Leslie Kane says is the best picture we have, which is an airplane that was taking, every 10 minutes was taking a picture of what was below the ground. And then later they developed it and saw this UFO. My favorite is the Ariel School, 1994, the kids in broad daylight seeing a craft and communicating with little alien beings. Yeah. Right. But there are others, Westfall School in Australia, in Great Britain, the Broadhaven School. These are all kids, right? So do your homework as far as the nuts and bolts is concerned. And I think that you will see, as myself, and let me just say for myself, I'm just an academic, right? So I'm just interested in this stuff from a dispassionate and objective standpoint. But the more I read, the more I became convinced that there's certainly something here. What it is, not too sure, but there is something here. So I think if people become active participants, they'll see that too. For me, the real question is why are people covering this up? Because there clearly is a cover up. And again, you can go to, there's been some stuff written on this as well. It might be a defense thing. We want to get to commandeer these craft before the Chinese and the Russians do. Mm-hmm. Understandable, because if they perform like they seem to perform, it is a massive step up in technology. There's also the economic argument that this would be a whole new energy source, which would revolutionize our planet, move us away from oil and gas into something quite different, maybe some sort of gravitational type of thing. I can understand that argument as well. But I think there's more than that. There's going to be psychological disarray. If, in fact, what John Brennan has said is true about a different form of life, you can hypothesize logically that if they're that much more sophisticated technologically, then they also might be more sophisticated in an evolutionary sense. So, for example, your dogs and cats, right? You can communicate with them, but you can't say to your dog, so what'd you do today? And Fido doesn't say, well, you all went around the block, I had to go. It doesn't have self-reflective consciousness. We have self-reflection. We're a step up in the evolutionary ladder as far as that's concerned. Well, maybe they're a step above us. And that would be very scary because then we would be the dogs and cats in their library, right? So that would be kind of a psychological form of threat, if you can put it that way. Richard Dolan, I believe, was talking about this once, and he said, his researches talk about one part of this non-human intelligence, I mean, it could be various, right?
Mhm.
Might be something like a hive mind. This comes up a lot, right? It reminds you of Star Trek's Borg, right? The hive mind, only not quite as sinister, right? But he says they seem to be operating telepathically, and they have instant knowledge, right? So that is that would be a different form of consciousness, right? Sort of more like an insect form of consciousness, but much higher than insects, right? So now that starts getting into psychology. What kind of a blow to our species narcissism would this be? And if you look at psychology, there is this one narrative that says we've had these blows to our species narcissism for quite some time. So you go back to Copernicus, for example, and Galileo, and it was a blow to our species narcissism to think that that we revolve around the sun rather than the sun revolves around us. So it's not geocentrism, it's heliocentrism. And we know what happened to Galileo, or what the Catholic authorities did to him. And parenthetically, it was in 1992 when Pope John Paul II finally officially said Galileo was right. So, but Galileo was 1633. So it took, 300 years for, I mean, they knew it, right? But for them finally to admit, oh, yeah, that's right, But this shows you how defensive human beings can be with respect to something so minor, it seems to be, so minor. So, and you can think of like people in therapy, for example. I'm sure a lot of people listening to this have been in therapy, and let's say, romantic relationships are one of the main things in therapy. And let's say you repeat a pattern over and over again, and your therapist is trying to get you to see that maybe you have a daddy problem or a mommy problem. And you're like, oh, no. And then 5 years later, it's like, oh, God, yes. It takes you a long time, right? So that's the nature of human beings. So now this is true with evolution as well, right? So the Scopes monkey trial back in the early part of the 20th century. I mean, people are still like evolution doesn't exist, right? So you can see these politicians, this is more on the Republican side, not just respecting my Republican friends, but you can see all the people want to be president, and you can look this up. The reporter says, how many of you believe in evolution? And like one or two are like kind of doing this number, right? Because too much of their social base is like, yeah, maybe not, right? So, but that shows you, right? Well, can you imagine that, now we're beginning to go into space, and we have the James Webb Telescope, and we know there are exoplanets, and probably a billion, now they're saying a billion Earth-like planets in the Goldilocks realm. That's to say where water and people could live. Well, we've only been here as a species for about 200,000 or 300,000 years. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. The Milky Way is 14.5 billion years old. You'd like to think that some of those planets have developed life forms that are a little bit more advanced than us, and for them to be visiting us, well, it doesn't seem like it's a big step to admit to that, right? But people have a hard time with that, right? So we're Columbus before, he wasn't the first to land in America, but it was a big deal that the Earth is not flat, that it's a sphere, and there are other places. Well, now maybe there are other planets, and maybe other beings, and maybe like more advanced, and that's just a blow. And I can understand why people would be very, very fearful of that. Going back to the hive mind, I mean, if they, are basically communicating telepathically, I mean, that's very invasive. You have somebody in your head, right? So, yikes.
Yeah.
So, this is a big deal, and I can understand why. But at any rate, I think the empirical part is people have to be convinced that there is something going on. And so part of our conference was, yes, the Galileo Project with Avi and the Soul Foundation with Gary and Peter. They do a lot of this work, and people like Kevin Knuth and Wes Waters and others, they're doing work in this area. Kevin is coming out with he's just finished a 200-page, I think it's 200 pages, of all the data, all these published articles. There have been a lot of published articles summarizing their findings. And hopefully when people come out, when it comes out, people will go and read that. So remember that name, Kevin Knuth, SUNUTH, SUNY Albany, and you can go look at that and find out for yourself. Right, do the homework yourself and be convinced yourself. Don't listen to me. I'm just guiding you as to doing that work.
We spoke with Dr. Knuth.
That's what I have for the nuts and bolts, right? That's all I got for the nuts and bolts.
Well, that's a great start, and I do have some side questions about it, but maybe I'll save them for a hand raise session at the end, and we can pivot right into experiencer data and research.
Okay, so this is a little more difficult. Okay, people I'm sure at home are like, yeah, I've read some of that stuff. Sure, it's probably true, and then they go about their day. Ignoring the fact that they, may have, and this is sort of what Eric Davis tells me, and also Tim Gallaudet believes this as well. Tim is the Rear Admiral, and Eric is the physicist, astrophysicist at Baylor. That they actually are here, and they've been here for quite some time. This is the term ultra-terrestrial. That term means that they've been here for thousands of years, and they have bases like in the ocean. And Tim keeps telling me that we've only mapped about 10% of the ocean. And so he thinks that they actually have bases. Eric thinks that they've isolated where the bases are. I know that sounds extremely strange, but that may, if you're an ultra-terrestrial guy, then that would be what you would say. And that fits well with the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which is they're from other planets in our solar system, right? So those are the two terms that are bandied about a lot, ultra-terrestrial and extraterrestrial. But the experiencers, now this crowd, basically, the most famous of these are the people who've been abducted, right? So this is really hard for people to believe. John Mack, the psychiatrist at Harvard, was the first guy to really take a hard look at this and to try to make it respectable. Most of these experiencers that I've talked to who came out of the closet, so to speak, back in the 30, 40 years ago, they would go to psychiatrists and they would say, well, you're nuts. You're crazy. And so give you some medicine and maybe, put you in a ward for a while. And John was really the first person to say, I don't think they're nuts. He did at the beginning. But then after, a lot of case histories, he really came to believe that there was something there. And he actually had some of these experiencers in his house with him. And he would talk with them. And he wrote a couple books, but the book that I think everyone should read is called Passport to the Cosmos. And I think that's actually classic in this field. And if you go and you just read that, right? He coined the term experiencers as a way of rehabilitating them. Like, they're not nuts, right? This is real. This is happening. But some of the things that they talk about are so out there that I can understand why people would think they must be nuts. Because if they're not nuts, then this is a whole new reality we're talking about, right? This is something like a multiverse. And this is where, it's not just the ultra-terrestrial or the extraterrestrial, but now it's the interdimensional hypothesis that the experiences are really, there's sort of the data for that. And so...
like experiences that are not physical, but in some meaningful sense real. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. So some of these people in their body get taken aboard ships. Other people, their consciousness comes out of their body while their body is like in their bed, and they go to another place, so to speak. And how do we speak about that other place? Well, probably the best way of speaking about it is, another dimension, right? Kind of like ours, but just a little bit off. Maybe a different vibrational frequency or something like that, right?
I kind of like that a little bit more. The challenge with dimension is that it has this other important meaning in the physical sciences and even in hard sci-fi of like spatial and temporal dimensions. And when we port that over to basically use it twice, once to mean something from the fifth or sixth spatial or temporal dimensions, and then once to mean something from a different spiritual plane, I think it sort of muddies the water. So I would love for us to find some kind of vocab that allowed us to parse those concepts, because I think they are meaningfully distinct
Yes, that's fine. I mean, this is an ongoing kind of conversation, but it's clearly something sort of outside normal waking consciousness that they're experiencing. And a lot of these people have lost time, right? So they'll be abducted at, sometime in 2 a.m, and then they wake up and it's 10 a.m. And this is not also out of the realm of some of the empirical data. For example, there was a craft that was crashed, and the military went to retrieve it, and they went into the craft, and they were in the craft for about 10 minutes, but when they came out, 4 hours had elapsed. So there's kind of an oddness in time, so to speak. It's like a different time, right?
Yeah, that report is new to me. I have heard reports about spatial differences going to an object and it's much larger on the inside.
Yes, right. Well, that too, right? They go in and it's like a football field, right? So but it starts to speak like to a new kind of physics, if we want to put it that way, we don't really quite understand. But they do. If they exist, then they clearly do, and they've mastered it, whereas we have not, which is scary for anybody.
Yeah, it sort of sounds like we maybe have some breadcrumbs in this direction, just like the fact that we at least have a concept of space-time as a sort of fundamental substrate of reality helps move us toward this, because if you can manipulate space-time, you could make an area larger than it looked, or, behave strangely in terms of time.
All those things. I'm sure you've had guests on who can talk to that. I mean, I'm not an astrophysicist. I just talk with them. And I think I got maybe it was a D in astronomy or something. No, I passed
it. Hard stuff. And I would point people to our discussion with Kevin Knuth.
Okay, so he's been on your show. Great.
A little bit about that, yeah.
He would be the guy to go to, right? He would absolutely be the guy to go to. So, so the question is, how do we think about this? And, let me read you a quote, which is pretty interesting. This is pre-John Mack, right? Who made this stuff, respectable, if I can put it that way, although they tried to fire him from Harvard. But this is, we're talking before the show about how hard it is for people to talk about this, especially if you're in academia and you're pre-tenure, then, it's a harder road for you to pass through if you admit to having interest or even published in this area.
Yeah.
And they did try to fire John Mack. I mean, they got a committee together at Harvard and they tried to boot him. They didn't in the end. Thankfully, there were some psychologists that came to his aid, particularly George Valiant, by the way, who was a sort of world famous psychoanalyst that was the head of the Harvard Grant Study. And they hauled him in, and he basically defended John, which is not to say that he thought it was real, but just that he defended his work as sort of academic freedom. But as a scholar in religion, how are we to think of these experiencers? Yeah. And this is just me speaking. This is not other people. I think of them as sort of a cadre of sort of modern day people who are having spiritual or religious experiences. And what I mean by modern day is that it's not necessarily church. That is to say, it's not necessarily within a tradition, although the content of some of these abductees end up being religious, but some are not. They're more what we call unchurched. But in the academic study of mysticism and spirituality, as we'd like to call it, the 20th century has seen the birth of this sort of a modern form, which is outside of traditions. And the person that is sort of targeted as instigating this, or the denouement, the apex of a historical process, is William James, the Harvard philosopher and psychologist. And many people listening might know of his book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, which is a classic in the field, and that everyone who is a scholar in my field ends up having to read at least for their doctoral exams. And what James did was really quite interesting. Is he went to Edinburgh to give the Gifford lectures, and that's what the book Varieties of Religious Experience is. It's a series of lectures. I mean, it's massive. It's hundreds of pages. I mean, when I give a lecture, I sweat for 3 months over like 10 pages.
Mhm.
He went there and wrote hundreds of pages. It's really phenomenal. And there's one chapter in there which is just called Mysticism, and I really hope that people will go read that. And he looks at all the different church traditions of mysticism, and sort of siphons out how to characterize these kinds of experiences.
Mm.
And then he talks about experience he had of his own. And he said in that he came to see that the universe is composed of multiple realities that are separated by what he called, and this is a direct quote, the filmiest of screens.
Mm.
Right. So this gets back to what we're talking about, interdimensionality or different vibrational frequencies.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that no accounting of the universe can be had without taking into account all of these multiple realities.
Mm.
Now, the reason I remark upon that is because he had a correspondence with a guy named Charles Hinton. Charles Hinton was a mathematician, and Charles would come into his class and he would talk about his work. And Charles was very interested in, this is why I went to the dimensional stuff, dimensional realities. And he actually was the guy that invented the jungle gym.
Oh, really?
Yeah, for kids. And
Love those things.
I mean, when I was a kid and I saw the jungle gym, I was like, what the hell is going on here? I always thought it was weird. And so when I found out about that, I thought, well, now I know why it's so weird, is because he's trying to sort of get dimensionality in there. But he's very interested in fourth dimensional cubes. That was really
cubes.
Yeah, fourth dimensional. And he coined a term for fourth dimensional cubes, and that term was the tesseract. And that got into like the Avengers, for example. People right? Wrinkle in Time. So him and James are talking. So this is what I mean by sort of a modern form of religious experience, right? Where people are having, these kinds of, interesting experiences. Now, as with religious experiences, the content of the abductees, and by the way, it's not just abductees. Sometimes, I've talked with people who say they just meet them in person, right? And they talk about the Greys, or they talk about the Nords, right? These sort of different species. Mm-hmm. And so the content varies, but there is, for my purposes, what I find interesting is that there seems to be one structural element that is involved with a lot of these, which is communication by telepathy. We've talked about this before. Telepathy seems to be a preferred way for these beings to communicate with us. And this is important to me because in trying to rehabilitate the experiencers and frame them as an actual modern form of religious experience, then telepathy becomes a good entry. Because contra those psychologists that want to pathologize this group, which, by the way, I'm not in favor of. I mean, clearly there are some who, are not well, but which is true of in religion as well. There are some people who are a little on the crazy side, but I think these people are real, and I've talked to them, and they strike me as being, actually, sober, rational people. By the way, another place for people to go is to look at this stuff. Darren King has a series of podcasts, and he strikes me as being very much the real deal. He's associated with the John Mack people. He's an experiencer, and you can just, on your daily walk or run, you can listen to the podcast. They're all about 30, 40 minutes, and he's got like hundreds of them. So you can really get into the literature here, along with John Mack's book, the
Passport to the Cosmos.
But the telepathy, a lot of these psychologists, particularly psychoanalysts, which John Mack was one, they seem to have a very selective view of its history. I mean, Freud, for example, the founder of psychoanalysis, was an absolute believer in telepathy. He wrote 4 papers on telepathy, my friends, 4.
Really?
Yeah. So now that's been shunted aside by the medical establishment, kind of like the Apocrypha of psychoanalytic papers, right? Just like in the Bible, the Apocrypha, like they're hidden, right? We don't want to look at this stuff. Well, it's not in the canon. And by the time he got to the 4th, which is a paper called Dreams and Occultism, which you can view in a book called New Introductory Lectures on Psychoanalysis, go to the last couple of pages, and he virtually tries to develop a theory of how telepathy operates.
Cool.
And then if you go through the history, Heinz Kohut started something called, or he was a member of something called object relations theory, which occurs after World War II. Well, he wrote a book called Forms and Transformations of Narcissism. And right in the middle of that, he cites Freud's work on telepathy. And he talks about his own experiences with telepathy in the consulting room. Sudi Kakar, who's a world-famous Indian psychoanalyst who recently passed away, he wrote a book called The Inner World. And he basically, coming out of India and the Upanishads and Hinduism, he was a Hindu, gives credence to this telepathic forms of communication. So, there is a lot of work within psychoanalysis itself that tries to rehabilitate telepathy as being kind of an original form of communication. And I don't think that we can just sort of, ignore it anymore. People can also go view the telepathy tapes, which is something just Google that. And they're doing research on that a lot with autistic kids.
That has come up in nearly every episode I've had since it came out. And I just want to flag that I would like to see some more science on it, because to the extent there has been debunking of it, it at least throws some significant questions that need to be answered on the table, specifically about the mothers of the kids being read in on the target of the telepathy. Like, I think if we're going to get an objective read on this, we're going to need to do this experiment in a situation where the mothers don't have the answer.
Right. I'm not saying it's real. I'm saying that there are plenty of people in the psychoanalytic tradition and elsewhere that think that there might be something to this.
Yeah.
And so
I also point people to Dean Radin's work on this, like the book Real Magic is a good place to start. And the general area of psi research is like another entire interesting bucket that we could use some more scientific investigation of, in the same way that we should look into UAP more.
Yes. Well, I mean, there's clearly going to be an intersection here with the experiencers. I mean, in my view, the empirical side is like the head side of the coin, but the tail side is experiencers. And I don't think you can really divorce the two. There are too many people who have seen UFOs or UAPs who have also had some sort of experience and some sort of paranormal consciousness evoked. And so it's hard to separate them one from the other. Want to start with the empirical stuff, but I think it moves very quickly into it. By the way, I mean, there are plenty of instances of other kinds of species that have other kinds of senses. Elephants, for example, can communicate over tens of miles through decibel ranges.
Really?
Yes. This was actually, you can Google that. People can Google that.
Cool.
There's a woman who actually was taping them, and then she had this idea that maybe they're communicating outside the human decibel range, and it turns out that's the case. That's how they communicate. People with dogs, my dog, take him on a walk, and he can smell tennis balls that are buried in people's yards, right? So, I mean, that is really incredible. Right?
A book I point people to on this front is An Immense World by Ed Young, which starts off really strongly with an investigation of the different things animals would see if you put them even in the same room. Some of them are perceiving ultraviolet lights, and some of them are feeling sound and sensing heat. And this goes right to your point about the evolutionary difference likely between us and some other kinds of beings. If they're visiting, they may well have access to other parts of reality that we're just not able to perceive yet, or we can only glimpse.
That's right. So that's well framed. Empathy, by the way, is another kind of sense that psychologists talk about a lot. People who are empathic sort of understand another person's feelings, their opinions, their perspective. People who are non-empathic don't really care, but don't see it as well. Right? It's sort of it's an innate trait that can be developed. And a lot of people think that, part of the evolutionary process of human beings is the development of this empathic sense. It's a kind of seeing, so to speak. And for, psychologists listening to this, they're just like, absolutely, right? So they develop that during the course of their career. And they can hear things, and they see things, and they perceive things, right? So certain things, it might be just body language or something. It's a form of communication. Well, people who understand that will understand what a person is saying above and beyond what they're saying, in language. And maybe that person really doesn't understand even what they're trying to say, but their body is saying it for them.
My training is in acting, and you just got near to one of my favorite parts of the art form is those ineffable communications that you can't quite describe, but you can feel or sense when you see them.
Absolutely. I mean, theater, and my brother's an actor, so theater and psychology, I mean, they go hand in hand a lot, right? So these are all sort of ways to try to get people to start thinking, maybe there's a little bit more. And then once you go there, you might go into a little even more of the woo stuff, the psi stuff, as you were saying. I mean, there are people who are precognitive, that's to say they can guess a sports score, before the game is over. No betting allowed. But I've been around such people, and it's horrible to go to games with them. I literally have gone to games without telling me the score, and they're right. Like,
no way.
And I mean, this is just a personal anecdote, but I can't empirically verify this. But they told me, and I'm like, well, thanks for ruining the game for me.
Wow.
So I've talked with other people. A lot of my students seem to be able to come out of their body and float around town. And one of my students was, I can come out of my dorm room and I go into the air conditioning ducts and I go into other people's rooms. I love to tell that story because I'm telling my undergraduates, better behave, because you never know when a fellow undergraduate is coming into your room.
Uh-huh.
So, and his brother, by the way, also seemed to have that talent and told me completely, unrelated to what he told me about going through the air conditioning ducts, about coming out of the body. Remote viewing, of course, this is well known. The military's taken interest in this. There's a whole series of Stanford experiments on remote viewing. People can Google that. So there seems to be other kind of modes of perceiving reality. And so the experiencers seem to be getting into this. And this actually leads to the question, if the NHI UAP, if they're more technologically advanced and they're more advanced in consciousness, well, what might that look like? Right? It might be that hive consciousness. It might be the telepathic stuff. It might be that they are precogs, or, that they're formless beings that can take form, right? This really starts going, I mean, this is why it's segueing right into religion.
Yes.
Because this religion has documented this, whether you believe it or not, but there are 9 billion people on the planet and about 7 are religious in some sense. They don't have to buy into all of this, but the people who were founders of religions and the saints and the mystics, they're all in this bucket, right? If you read it, they're all in this bucket. So if I was just talking about a modern form of religious experience, well, then what's the relationship between that and the more traditional form of religious experience? And it turns out there's a lot of overlap. And I'll give you one example of that. We were talking about telepathy. For those Catholics out there, go right straight to St. Teresa's famous interior castle. This is not Mother Teresa. This is St. Teresa back in the 1500s. And she talks about her experiences. And you can go to Mansion 6, go to Book 3. And in that, she talks about what she calls locutions. Locutions, in our terminology, would be divine telepathy. And she talks very much about how they come. But basically, she's talking to people. Now, she says sometimes it's just the diseased imagination that she's getting. You meditate too much, you pray too much, you're getting a lot of the unconscious coming up. And she understands that. But she says some of it is from other beings in other places. Sometimes from the Lord, right? Other times from saints. But they're talking to her. And so, well, I mean, if you're a believing Catholic and she is a doctor of the church, so she's protected by the church. They can't say she's nuts, although there have been papers written on her being a schizophrenic. And I've read those, and I would like to have a conversation with those people, because I can tell you right now, they get her wrong. They don't understand. It's like a case history. They get the case wrong. I've written about this myself. I don't mind if they, make an analysis of an actual case, but they better get the case right. She's dead, so you can't talk with her, but they get the case wrong. I'm not going to go into that, but I'm just saying, if you get the case right, well, part of the case is that someone is talking to Teresa. It's not just Teresa, right? I've heard this from many meditators and many traditions about how they have telepathic contact, like, for example, with their guru. So it's very big in the shamanistic world as well. So, well, what is going on there, right? So if the experiencers are having telepathic contact with some beings and the mystics are having telepathic contact with other beings, what is that other side? What is that reality? And this is where it gets much more complicated, because we have maps of cities. So if you and I are in Houston and I say, let's go down to Alley Theater and see a show, and you can tell me about the acting, right? And you say, well, how'd I get there? And I say, well, just get a map of Houston, right? I'll meet you right downtown. You go, oh yeah, okay, I'll meet you there at 6 o'clock or whatever. But the map of this other world or worlds, they're different. And so you can't just say, yeah, draw up a map, right? So, I mean, Christians traditionally have, well, there's heaven, there's hell, and there's, earth, right? There's sort of the three big, areas of existence. You get to certain Hindu scriptures, there's 14, right? There's 7 above, 7 below. And there are beings in all of these different realities. So it gets much harder to talk about this. And everyone sort of thinks they have an in to this stuff. Right, that their map is the best map or the only map or the preferred map, and that's fine, right? Because we don't know, right? But there are these maps, right? And so you get heavenly journeys, and all over the place, and we have to be very cognizant of that. So it's not just Teresa here, right? So St. Paul, famously for those Christians, in 2 Corinthians says, "I know a man who went to the third heaven and paradise." Well, okay, so that is an actual cosmology. So it's been a lot written on that. Actually, it's really a Jewish cosmological map, and so there is a 7-tiered heaven, and it goes to the third heaven, and then ostensibly paradise would be the 7th. There's some controversy about that, but a higher one.
That's where we get this phrase, "I'm in 7th heaven."
I'm in 7th heaven, right? So Muhammad adopted a similar type of thing. The Merkabah mystics in Judaism, starting with Enoch back in Genesis, are, this is also how you get through these various levels. It's difficult and dangerous, right? So that would be an example of that. So when we're talking about religion here, we're talking about, there's a very specific way of defining religion where you're giving preference to the founders, to the saints, to the mystics, not just some ritual, like communion, as good as that may be for certain people, or meditation might be good. We're talking about actual encounters with other kinds of realities, whether you want to call them multiverse or other dimensionals, or, different kinds of...
I like planes. I guess... yeah, frequencies are good. Vibration is good. I like the word planes. Maybe this comes from Dungeons and Dragons. I don't know what the origin of that word is, but I like spirit planes for this like sort of layers of the onion concept personally.
Yeah, that's fine. Whatever it is. I mean, obviously we can't, conclude exactly what it is. We only know that it is in the scriptures and in the traditions, and it's also in the modern experiencers. So I'm trying to rehabilitate the experiencers and give them some sort of street cred, right? And then, but I'm also, as an academic, I do work in the traditions and in the mystics and the saints, and it's just there, right? I mean, it's undeniable, and a lot of people who are in the traditions and who are adepts at this, and I've talked with them, are like, yeah, I've been to this reality, or I've talked with this being, or this is the way it is. And so, as an objective academic, I accumulate what all of these things are. And I can tell you right now that, some of the constants are, a lot of it deals with time, right? Outside of time, sometimes completely outside of time. I had one adept say, time stopped for me when I was 50. Time stopped for me. I had no idea what he was talking about, but what does that mean to say time stops, right? Yeah. But they enter back into time, right? But they can also go back in time or into the future, because there really is no past or future. When there's no time, everything exists sort of simultaneously.
And that definitely brings this word dimensionality back into the picture, that tesseract concept of stepping up a layer. That is an appropriate, accurate scientific use of the concept of dimensionality, because if you were to move up a dimension in time, you could move around it in the same way that in the third dimension, you can move around the second dimension easily.
Absolutely. So, I mean, and this is scary for a lot of people. Going back to the dog analogy, I mean, they don't have self-reflective consciousness. We do. Well, a step up or 2 or 7 steps up, they might have different kinds of capacities, and we really are the dogs and cats in their library, right?
Yeah.
So, that they're benevolent, right? That they're not wicked. But that would be also part of the fear, right? But
And it's part of the classic religious story and question, right? What forces are at play above our heads, and
absolutely.
what intentions do they have?
Right. So Lou Elizondo wrote a book called Imminent, where he talks a lot about this. And apparently there's a cadre in the military that are sort of a certain kind of Christian, and they they think this is demonic. And so he talks about that in the book. So they don't want it let out because they think it's giving some sort of credence to the demonic forces. I know a physicist at Rice who basically believes in this stuff and also believes that they're demons. I was shocked. I was having lunch with her and we just sort of came up, and then she said, "Oh yeah, they're demons. And this is a person with a PhD." And I was like, "Geez, that's really weird."
Yeah, but, strong claim.
Yeah, I mean,
and why would you think that they would be just demons? Like, if there are higher vibrational entities,
right?
Wouldn't it stand to reason that there might be a variety of them in the same way there are varieties of us?
Right. So I mean, part of what we want to do is we want to open this up to scholars so that they track what might be the relationship to what the experiencers are saying and what is said in the tradition. So, the ancient astronaut, you can get that on the History Channel, whatever. I mean, they've been doing this for a long time. So it'd be like, well, it's the Vamana tradition, right? This would be in the Jain, Tibetan Buddhism, Hindus, where their craft, right? And some of the early saints came down from a higher plane, as you like to say, or a heaven of existence in a Vamana. And a Vamana is a nuts and bolts craft, but it's also capable of being an interdimensional, so to speak, craft. So they come down from the heavens, they step off the craft, and there they are, right? So
yeah, I've heard somebody I described this once as a concept of a spiritual submarine. Basically, that if you're a higher dimensional or higher vibrational entity, if you want to go to a lower vibration, you need some technology to do that. So you build yourself a structure through which you can move. With which you can move through the planes.
Right. So, I mean, you can never prove any of that stuff, and it does get into sort of the ancient astronaut stuff. But the Merkabah tradition in Judaism, which also incorporates Christianity and Islam, right? If you think of Paul as being essentially a Merkabah mystic, now the Christians listening to this are like, "Oh, there's a blasphemer." Parsons. Well, there's actually been a bunch of papers written on this. I mean, it looks like that's probably true, right? So,
what is probably true?
That he was operating in a Merkabah mystical intellectual milieu, and that his ascent from the third heaven to paradise was a Merkabah type of thing. You can go to a guy named Christopher Moray Jones, wrote a book called Paradise. Sorry, it's a paper called Paradise Revisited. It's in Harvard Theological Review, 1994. It's a 2-part paper. It's really, really excellent. And by the way, it's peer reviewed by Harvard Theological Review, which is like the hardest journal to get a paper published in. I mean, you can forget it, right? Or you can go to Alan Siegel's book, Paul the Convert, right? Who thinks that Paul is he thinks of Paul in more sort of in the Reformed rabbinic tradition, not as a real Christian, but he agrees that this is sort of the Merkabah stuff. Now that's actually taken up by certain Christian theologians. Bruce Chilton wrote a book called Rabbi Jesus. He thinks that Jesus was off in the forest with John, was also doing Merkabah stuff. He puts Jesus in the Merkabah tradition as well, along with people like Enoch, right? This is the Genesis saint that was Jesus before Jesus, that was at the right hand of the Father before Jesus displaced him, so to speak. Metatron, Enoch, sort of the combined term, right? Or Elijah, right, in 2 Kings, who goes to heaven on a fiery chariot. Think of the song "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," which probably was referring to 2 Kings, coming forward to take me home, right? So now that's an African American spiritual. They're enslaved. They want to be taken home. And I suppose if you were, a modern day mystic, you might say, well, we're in prison on planet Earth. Please take me home in a chariot, and I can go up to the seventh heaven and paradise itself, right? But remember that Paul and Enoch, all these people, I mean, they didn't know anything about exoplanets. They barely knew anything about the Earth being a globe, right? Most of them were flat earthers, quite frankly. I mean, even Augustine, a couple hundred years later, is like, yeah, it's probably a globe. I think it's probably round. I mean, he's having that discussion about these people, but we're way advanced. And when I say that, the religious like, no, you're a blasphemer. And well, maybe, we're progressing, right? And maybe there are beings in other vibrational frequencies, other planets, whatever, that can manifest empirical craft. This is from the religious standpoint, right? I'm not saying I believe this. I'm saying this would be the argument. But it needs to be, all this stuff really needs to be investigated in a much more thorough fashion, and that's what we're trying to do. By the way, if you look at religious traditions like Nation of Islam, Steve Finley, a graduate of our department, has written about this. Louis Farrakhan talks about going onto a UFO, and Elijah Muhammad, who's the founder of NOI, was piloting the thing. Vatican-affiliated astronomers they probably know that there's something going on. There may have been a 1933 craft that they got a hold of, according to David Crush. Mormonism, of course, there are other planets. There was the Hare Krishna crowd out of Hinduism in the 1960s. There's a book called Easy Journey to Other Planets, believe it or not. They talked about through yoga, you can actually, ascend to these other worlds, so to speak, to meet these other beings. So there's a lot going on in the traditions that begin to intersect with the modern religious experience or crowd. And, if you have the empirical as the heads and the experience as the tails, well, it goes into religion pretty quickly, and obviously this is going to offend people all over the place. Because, scientists are like, well, if that's true, then our science is a bit wrong. It has to bring consciousness into it. Well, that's a paradigm shift, right? So science is going to have to be changed, but religion's going to have to be changed as well, right? So you're talking about a new paradigm where science and religion morph into something quite new. It's not science, but it ain't religion, right? It's something even more new. And it may be that 200 years from now, people look at this podcast and say, oh, they were so dumb. Of course it's something new. We know that now, right?
Sure.
But we're being, I don't know how many emails I'm going to get. And, my email, by the way, is jjkreipel@rice.edu. So for those of you who want to email me, that's my email. He's going to kill me for that. Again, this goes back to why this is so seriously defended. If there are 9 billion people on the planet and 7 billion are religious, right? A lot of people are like, the shaman crowd, by the way, so we've been believing that all along, right? So go to John Mack's book, right? And they think there's a lot of racism involved, and people like discounting this part of their tradition,
right?
Which is really big, right? So
or indigenous traditions that have believed this stuff for tens of thousands of years, arguably.
Right. That's right. But let me just weave another narrative about this, which may be of interest to some folks. Well, maybe not. One of the ways in which this whole conference at Rice got started was because I was emailing Diana Pasuco, who's my colleague at University of North Carolina, Wilmington.
Oh, cool.
And I was saying to her that, a lot of your work sounds like something, like an extraterrestrial theology, if I can put it that way. And so she said, yeah, that could be true. And I said, you should try to edit a book about that, and then we'll take it to the American Academy of Religion and try to get a lot of people interested in this. And that morphed into the conference, right? So Diana was part of that conference, and Jeff Kreipel, my colleague, was part of that conference. And that's why we had this structure. But this whole notion of an extraterrestrial theology, which, people think is for the birds, let me just try to justify at least the attempt at something like that is, all religious traditions, and even within traditions, try to get back to that you are, right? The original event. Let me just take Christianity as an example. Back in the 1920s, like fundamentalism, right? We had to get back to the fundamentals because we've strayed. So they had an in on what Christianity was really about, right? Well, the Catholics thought that too before the Protestants came along, right, during the Reformation, and they said, no, you don't. Luther and Calvin, like, we protest everything you're saying. And there was a split within the Christian tradition, right? In fact, there are a lot of splits. There's a lot of splits within Protestantism, and they have different doctrines. A lot of them do, right? And so, that becomes problematic because you're always looking back at that event through the lens of your theology. And it turns out that's That's what religion really is. You'll never get to that Ur event. You can believe you've gotten to the Ur event, but everyone has a different. Take Islam, Sunnis and Shias, right? Shia literally means the party of Ali, who was one of the caliphs, one of the, we would call them the apostles, right? Muhammad and his companions. And so Ali becomes, a source of authority, not so much for the Sunnis. Mm-hmm. So if you want to get back to that Ur event, like what Muhammad said, you're going to have different lens. Saudi Arabia and Iran, they don't like each other very much, right? Well, the Protestants and the Catholics don't like each other very much either, or historically they haven't. 1980s, Britain versus Ireland, the fighting that went on there, 30 Years' War, Google that. 1920s, when the Catholics came into America, the Protestants were like, completely repressing them. Now they ruled the Supreme Court, but there's always these tensions within traditions, much less, between traditions, right? That's very important. And and this is going to be difficult, a real slog for people to think, about an extraterrestrial theology. Let me give you an example of how hard this is going to be. When I was in graduate school, I had two friends, one male, one female, and to protect the innocent, I'll call one Betty, and I'll call the other Fred. And Betty and Fred were going out, and we all thought, that's a good couple, and they're going to get married and stuff. And I think you can see what's coming here. She was Catholic. He was Protestant, evangelical Protestant. Okay, so that's sort of the story is going to probably guess the conclusion. So at any rate, they're going out for a while. And then Betty comes to my dorm room, and she's clearly upset. And she says, I need to talk to you. And I said, okay, what's up? She said, well, Fred asked me to marry him. And I went, great. And she kind of broke into tears. She said, I don't know if I can do it. And I said, oh, do you love him? She goes, very much. And then I said, well, why can't you marry him? She said, because his name is Fred. Okay, I'm just kidding. No, just kidding. Of course, I said, I wouldn't marry him either. I mean, Fred, come on. So long story short, they had to get over their differences, Catholicism and Protestantism. 20 years later, she's a Quaker, and he is in Native American spirituality. So people, I guess, can change. But in that moment, how hard was it? So I had a similar instance with another friend of mine in graduate school, and he was a devout Presbyterian, and his girlfriend was Buddhist. And he was like, I don't think I can marry her. I mean, she doesn't confess the name of Christ. And well, they did get married, and they're very happy and all that kind of stuff. So people can change. But I mean, the obstacles here, going back to Galileo, going back to evolution, are going to be almost insurmountable. And the amount of hatred coming the way of anybody who tries to do this is also going to be insurmountable. So going back to Paul, for example, I mean, I was in Jerusalem for a year with Hebrew University Jewish mystical scholars. They take Paul and the third heaven paradise as being part of their tradition, Merkabah mysticism, but a lot of Christians do not, right? So you're taking a singular event, this event up to the throne of God, and they're interpreted differently, right? So it's going to be almost impossible to get them out of that. And now you're going to say, well, it's all really the product of these higher minds that can manifest ships and their other planets. And
do you think some religious traditions are better poised to encounter an expanding reality along these lines?
Yeah, I mean, but the thing is that within religious traditions, there are a lot of people that discount the mystical, right? And the saintly. I mean, maybe not the saints as people, but their visions and stuff. They discount it, almost entirely, right? That there's something wrong with that, right? I want to just go to church and listen to the priest and follow the commandments and stuff. But I mean, if this is taken seriously, then the traditions are really, what they're all saying is you have to transform yourself. That's something you have to do. I mean, I can't do that for you. You can't do it. Each person has to do it. I'm going to go all Krishnamurti on you, right? You have to do it yourself. And they're advising you, but no one can do it but you. But that's the message. And if you go back to the nuts and bolts, they're more technologically advanced. Well, if they're also more spiritually and, say, ethically advanced, then it's the same message. You got to transform yourself. You want to meet us? Transform yourself. prayer, meditation. This is what Jake Barber and the Skywatcher crowd are really up to, right? They can call down, or Chris Bledsoe, right? They can call down these folks, right?
Yeah.
But they're all like, it's, the instrument is not the telescope or the microscope. The instrument is your mind. And you have to cultivate that. And, parenthetically, and I don't want to out people, but, part of my task as a religious studies professor is to go into all these communities, talk with people. But I've heard tell of this, like dozens of these people. Oh, yes, of course. I commune with these beings and stuff. I mean, it's not just a little bit. It's a lot of it.
Yeah.
So, and they're not crazy. Some of them are really quite high up in the hierarchy. So
I want to bounce this off you. It seems to me intuitive that, as you pointed out, we're going to have some serious work to do confronting our expanding understanding of reality all across society, but specifically within religion. I think it's going to be a challenge to incorporate new scientific information. In some cases, there may be resistance to even investigating like truth claims from various religious traditions. But also, at the same time, I feel like there might be a motion toward religion just by virtue of expanding our understanding of the mystical. And if we do just kind of break through a couple of previous restrictions, like not believing in psi effects or telepathy or any kind of spiritual reality, and we get some scientific claims that say, well, actually there are elements that are sort of beyond what we previously viewed as the physical that are real. It seems to me like that might open the door to kind of a flood of interest in religious activity, and it could potentially be good for faith. I wonder what you think of that.
I would love to see that happen. I'm an optimist, but I'm a guarded optimist. I also know what human beings are capable of on the dark side. And so I guess as a scholar, the way that I would frame that would be, in terms of my own discipline, which is more on the psychological side, is that there's this, historically speaking, mysticism and spirituality in the traditions sort of gave birth in the 19th and 20th century to a kind of psychological form of self-transformation of spirituality and mysticism that I call psychospirituality. So people like Carl Jung, would be an example of that most people know. And you go to your local Jung Institute, and you find multiple traditions, and they're all shopping their practices and their worldviews, but sort of in conjunction with sort of a Jungian psychological lens about individuation and self-reformation, those kinds of things. So it's already morphing a little bit out of the traditions and adopting a different kind of nomenclature. But the net effect should be that people get better, right? They get more moral. They understand themselves. There's more inwardness. They come to grips with their unconscious. They become more empathic. And so you can see that sort of taking over, at least in the Western world, certainly, with all of the different institutes that are around and all the self-help stuff. And some of it is, debatable in terms of whether it's good or not. Some of it's, self-narcissism. But others it really gets into sort of transformational type stuff where you're actually getting less ego and more invested in, social reformation and helping others. And that seems to be growing and expanding. And I think that is a good thing, from my perspective. And, I try to track that as a scholar. Some of my works, engage that. And, but change is slow. It's real slow. And there's always, backlashes to that, which I think we're seeing now. Actually, we're seeing a big backlash to that. And so all you got to do is hope and, hope we don't blow ourselves up.
Yeah.
And, but like I say, cautiously optimistic, but stick in your lane. And, you can work, I don't want to be perceived by the people out there as being anti-tradition. I'm very pro-tradition. Use your tradition to reform yourself, right? To get better, to be more ethical, to be more empathic. If you can do it, great. Stick with that, right? I'm not saying necessarily that you have to go into the psychospiritual world. A lot of people do that, or they do sort of a combination of that, and that's fine. But if you can do that within your own tradition, fantastic.
Yeah.
But every person has their own gradient, and they should seek that out. And don't listen to me. Just take whatever you want from me and dispense with the rest and go your way.
It's interesting that you should phrase it in terms of this individual progress and like moral journey. I find that resonant and important, and it often crops up toward the end of these conversations. Like, what can we all do? Try to improve ourselves. But I also, as somebody, I'm not particularly religious. I would love to see a resurgence of at least the community aspect of religious worship, gathering, just like attending to each other, and I. At the same time that I'm happy that we've got a world where people can individually take these journeys, I would love to see a world where we feel drawn to do some of that together. And to some extent, it happens in other places like performing arts. People go to music festivals, people go to theater and movies and dance events. But there is something special about joining with your community to do some kind of spiritual thing, however detailed you get. But that has been declining over the last 100 years, and at least in America, or I think across the West. And I'm not sure I understand all the reasons for that, but I do think if there were some scientific breakthrough that said, well, there's a there, that people might actually go back, because at least part of the dribble, it seems to me, is people thinking, oh, well, it's just not real. Like, people, they're giving us all these rules and they're telling us what to do, but all the spiritual stuff is just made up. So like, why would I follow these rules? Why would I go to church and then get these secondary benefits of community connection?
Right. Well, a lot of people actually, from what I understand, actually do go to church, and they don't buy into the ideology, but they go for the community.
Yeah.
But I've heard that a lot in even academic circles, and particularly among psychologists, that there's this now real awareness that we've somehow have lost this sense of communality, and we have to get it back, that it's really important for mental health to have that. And so I think the tide is turning backwards towards that. And what form that'll take, I think that's a little bit more up for grabs. But it's definitely on the rise, without any question. I think it's on the rise.
Can I ask, do you think some of this has to do with the idea of truth and the different projects of science and religion here with regard to that pursuit? Like, do you think of religion fundamentally as a pursuit of truth in some way, and how is that like profoundly different, if it is, from scientific pursuit of truth?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a huge question. I do think that religion tries to get at a truth, right? Or they say they do, right? Certainly metaphysically, right? Cosmologically, that they think they have a truth. That's going to have to be refined by the researchers of science. But so that would be sort of like one bucket, right? Sort of the empirical part, which is always being, in some sense, qualified by the researchers of science, and should be, right? So like I say, these early folks didn't know about exoplanets or about galaxies, 2 trillion galaxies. So science comes along and says, our evolution, heliocentrism, all of those things absolutely should be. But there's also another part of truth, which is, the human truth. And I don't want to get too corny here, but, to me, the essence of any world religious tradition, or unchurched or churched, it sounds corny, but it's really love. I know that sounds corny, but that's really the bottom line. And that's for and everyone knows this deep down. Just think about the things that really matter to you the most, or the people that matter to you the most. And love is it, right? So now if you have that kind of, feeling towards not just the few people that you really love so much, but everybody, then, well, everything would be different, would it not? And so that's I don't know if you can get that towards a bunch of scientists telling us about sort of abstract truth, right? You usually hold that at a distance, say, oh, that's probably true. But the kind of, self-transformation that's needed to really have that kind of love, that's also extremely difficult, right? Which, by the way, again, parenthetically, going back to the mystics and stuff, if you really read them, they're not really saying, I'm going for this vision or I'm going for this insight. What they're saying is that vision or that insight makes me a more loving person towards my neighbor. That's going back to Teresa. We talked about Teresa. She has a bevy of visions and unitive experiences with the Lord and all that kind of stuff. But she says all of that is worth nothing unless it enables me to love my neighbor, basically. She says the two commands, love God and love your neighbor. How do you know if you love God? If you love your neighbor. So it's really about loving your neighbor.
Ooh,
so and people know this, right? How hard that is. Some of my kids in college, they're telling me about, I guess they're open with me, some experience they had, in some party under some drug or something, and then they go home and want to beat up their roommate because and I say to them, see, that's the point, right? It's not great. So you met Pan, you talked with Pan, great. But, that's not where it's at. You want to be able to go home and look at your roommate and say, I understand them better. I empathize with them better. I love them more, right?
Yeah.
That's where it is. And so you'd like to think that those more evolved beings are more evolved. That's where they're coming from. I know that's romanticizing it, but I'm optimistic that in the end that's also true.
Just want to say the mindfulness folks, I think, would say that state of universal love can be empirically experienced without any mysticism. If you move toward it in a thoughtful, structured way, you can achieve these states of love through meditation.
Absolutely. And then hopefully when you're out of meditation, you're still that way.
Yeah, right. And that's kind of the journey. So as we come toward a landing here, I wonder if you have ideas for us about what kind of intellectual posture we should try to hold as we confront the swirling facts and claims and cosmic ideas here in this space, from UAP to mysticism. And then if there's anything you'd like to return to and highlight or leave us with, I'd be happy to hear what you think is most important in this space.
Well, I would hope that people listening to me, if they haven't already fallen asleep, which is probably the case, yeah. And by the way, don't read my books because I don't know if people understand this, but the World Health Organization has actually recommended any of my books for people who suffer from chronic insomnia. So this would be, this is just so they know. But I really, really can't stress this enough. But if they find anything I've said valuable, Google it, research it, Google, and take the responsibility yourself. Be active, and never take anything at face value. Continue to accumulate facts. Continue to have a healthy skepticism. I mean, for all I know, everything I've said is just pure bunk, and if that's true, then I will accept that too. I'm led in this direction because I've talked with a lot of people in a lot of communities, religious communities, also the experiencer crowd, also the scientists, and from my researches, reading, as well as talking with them, I've come to think there really is something to this. But I don't think I can really convince anybody. I'm hoping that I've convinced people to do that work themselves. So they'll go off and they'll Google it and they say, Parsons is just full of crap. I've researched this and he's so wrong about this. Fine, great. That's what the academic space is, by the way, right? That is a social space where you just have a continual conversation, right? That's the nature of the space. It's a secular, critical, right? Pluralistic social space. So we don't bring beliefs in there, we examine beliefs. And I would hope that people would take that attitude, especially with this particular topic. And just, and by the way, a lot of these people I've referenced, they may not answer your emails. I will not, but other people might. Oh, that's right. JJ Kreipel at rice.edu. But I think, most of these people eventually will, or go to some of these conferences, right? Depending on, where you're at, and inform yourself, right? So there's one thing we're absolutely sure of, that we understand very little about this universe. Very, very little. It's much bigger. It's much more wondrous than we could possibly imagine. And you can bring that into your worldview and make it part of your day, right? Whenever you get kind of like all tense and anxious, think, it's so much bigger than this, right? That might be something to remind yourself of that would help you during your day, kind of like almost a brief meditation, right? So maybe that'll work. And if not, okay, well, dispense with that, move on.
Worth a try.
Right. But that is really, again, I cannot do that, right? This is Krishnamurti. One thing about Krishnamurti you can really like, right, is that don't go to the scripture, do it yourself. Do it yourself.
Wow.
So that would be it.
Well, thank you so much. Is there a place where you like people to engage with your work online? Or do you like being followed on LinkedIn or some social platform?
Honestly,
really.
I pretty much like being left alone. But if they want to go to the Rice University Religious Studies website, they'll see our faculty. They'll see me there, and they can look at all the boring stuff that'll help them put to sleep. There will be other people there that they might take an interest in. We have a program called the GEM program, Gnosticism, Esotericism, and Mysticism. It's a graduate program. And half the faculty is involved in that. And they can look at their dossiers as well. It's right there on the website, right? So, but I would also encourage them to go to the SOL, Soul Foundation website, and to the Galileo Project website, and to look at those folks as well, and look at their work. Right. And I think once they do that, I think things will probably change for them.
Thank you so much for investing so much of your precious time with us today. I know it was very helpful, and it was certainly a really fun conversation for me. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
Great to meet you. And, I really prize the work that you do. Thank you so much for that. And I hope you continue to move on, and maybe someday we'll actually meet, and that would be great.
I would love that.
And that's the show. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for listening or watching. If you like WTUFO and you want it to keep existing, support us at patreon.com/WTUFO or on YouTube or on Buzzsprout for as little as you want per month. Patreon or YouTube or Buzzsprout, this show is brought to you by you. So thank you very much for your support. I hope you keep listening, and I hope you have a lovely day.